At the Fort Bragg firing range, my father, Colonel Leland Bishop, roared in front of my own soldiers. "Look at her! A sergeant's salary is barely enough for dog food, Carrie." He thought he was breaking me. He thought he was putting his failed daughter in her place. What he didn't know was that I was already silently investigating the criminal conspiracy that he was running. A conspiracy that was selling out the lives of his own men for profit. This is the story of how I used the skills he despised to destroy the empire he built on lies. My name is Carrie Ann. I'm 35 years old, a sergeant first class in the United States Army, and at this moment I was standing in what felt like the seventh circle of hell. It wasn't just the oppressive, wet blanket heat of a North Carolina summer pressing down on firing lane 7 at McKellar's Lodge. It was the hostile silence that felt even more suffocating. A bead of sweat traced a cold path down my spine, but it had nothing to do with the temperature. From the periphery, I could feel the sideways glances, hear the low, venomous whispers that coiled through the humid air. "That's Colonel Bishop's daughter," one voice murmured, just loud enough for me to catch. "Bet she got a free pass," another added. My hand tightened on the grip of my M4 rifle, my fingers finding their familiar places on the cool, worn metal. I focused on my breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. A rhythm drilled into me until it was as involuntary as my own heartbeat. It was a shield. They knew nothing about me. They didn't see the faint, silvery line of a scar that peeked out from under the collar of my uniform, a permanent souvenir from a place that doesn't officially exist on any map. They didn't know about the nights spent staring at ceilings in countries whose names they couldn't pronounce, the bone-deep weariness that never quite leaves you. They saw only a name, a legacy, an appendage, and then they saw him. My father, retired Colonel Leland Bishop, was striding toward the firing line with the unshakable self-assurance of a god descending from his private Olympus. He was a titan here at Fort Bragg, a living legend whose stories were told with reverence in the officers' club. His posture was perfect, his silver hair immaculate, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the very air out of the space around him. In his world, there were officers, and then there was everyone else. I knew without a shadow of a doubt which category he placed me in. He was the sun, and I was just a disappointing shadow he was forced to cast. He didn't bother to lower his voice. The performance was the point. "Carrie Ann," he began, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. It was the same smirk that used to make my stomach clench into a tight, fearful knot when I was a child. "I hear you're still playing this little soldier game of yours." The words hung in the air, each one a perfectly aimed shot. He gestured vaguely at my uniform, a look of profound disappointment etched onto his features. "Tell me," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "how's a sergeant's salary treating you? Is it enough for dog food these days, or are you still coasting on my name to get by?" My jaw tightened, but I didn't speak. He wasn't finished. He turned, his gaze sweeping over a handful of young privates who were watching the exchange with wide, intimidated eyes. His voice dropped into a booming, authoritative register, the one he used for delivering orders. "Take a good look, men," he commanded, pointing a finger directly at me, at his own daughter. A perfect textbook example of wasted potential. She had a slot at West Point waiting for her. She could have been an officer, a leader with a real future. Instead, she chose this. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the disgust saturate his final words. She chose to be an enlisted grunt. The world went silent. The pop, pop, pop of distant gunfire seemed to vanish. All I could hear was a low, humming roar inside my own ears. A hot, scalding wave of shame washed up the back of my neck, more searing than the relentless Carolina sun. Every eye on the range was on me now, 100 pairs of them, all waiting for the tears, for the angry retort, for me to shatter into a million pieces right there on the dusty ground. They were about to be disappointed. One of my first instructors, a man whose face I can no longer remember, but whose words are etched into my soul, once told me, "The quieter you become, the more you are able to hear." In this deafening silence, I could hear everything. I didn't give my father another glance. I turned my back on him and faced the target. Inhale, exhale. Discipline is a fortress. It was the only home I'd ever truly had. I raised the M4 to my shoulder, the stock settling into the familiar groove. The weight was comforting, the cold metal a steadying presence. My world narrowed to the front sight post and the distant black circle 100 meters away. 5 shots. The sound was clean, dry, and brutally final. Crack, 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 crack. 5 explosions ripping through the strained silence. 5 holes appearing in the paper target, so close together, they looked like a single ragged tear in the center of the bullseye. A different kind of silence fell over the range now, one of shocked, grudging respect. Slowly, I lowered my weapon, placed it on the bench, and turned to face my father. My eyes were as cold and hard as the steel I had just commanded. He was staring at the target, his mouth slightly agape. For a single, glorious second, the mask of the great Colonel Bishop was gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered shock. He recovered quickly, clearing his throat and turning away with a dismissive huff. But I saw it, just for a flicker. It was the unmistakable glint of unease. And in that moment, as I stood there in the suffocating heat, a decision formed in the quietest, coldest part of my mind. This game he loved to play, the one where I was always the loser, I was going to end it. That night, sleep was a foreign country. Back in my small Spartan apartment in Fayetteville, the 4 walls seemed to press in. I methodically field-stripped my M4 on the worn rug, the familiar clicks of metal, a futile attempt to impose order on the chaos roaring in my mind. The image of my father's face at the firing range, that mask of arrogant disgust, was seared onto the inside of my eyelids. Every time I closed them, the phantom feeling of the cold rifle dissolved, replaced by the crisp feel of a different piece of paper from a different lifetime. The memory pulled me back 17 years to the day I got my acceptance letter from UNC Chapel Hill. I was 18, and the world was a promise. I remember running home from the mailbox, the thick cream-colored envelope clutched in my hand like a gold medal. The iconic Carolina blue letterhead felt like a ticket to a new universe. I burst through the front door of our large, stately house, a home that always felt more like a museum than a place people lived. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish, old leather, and my father's authority. He was in his study, the heart of his empire. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a heavy glass of amber bourbon sweating onto a leather coaster. The setting sun cast long shadows across the built-in bookshelves filled with military histories and legal texts. He was a king in his castle, and I was a subject presenting a tribute. I held out the letter, my heart pounding with a desperate, childish need for his approval. He took it, his eyes scanning the words without a flicker of emotion. The silence stretched, broken only by the clink of ice as he swirled his drink. Finally he looked up, his gaze devoid of warmth. "Good," he said, the word clipped. "What's the major? Law, business? You'll need a respectable degree for officer candidate school." I took a deep breath. "I'm going to enlist first, Dad," I said, my voice brighter than I felt. "I want to serve, like you." The change was instantaneous. A steel door slammed down behind his eyes. He set the bourbon glass down on the desk with a sharp thud. His face hardened. "Foolish," he hissed, the word a blade. "I served so that you wouldn't have to. I didn't raise you, didn't invest in you, to have you throw it all away to be an enlisted grunt." "I can still go to college after," I pleaded. "The GI Bill, I can—" He wasn't listening. He cut me off, pulling open a drawer. He produced a leather-bound checkbook from a private bank. "This," he said, his voice dropping to an icy tone, "is your college fund. Your mother and I have contributed to it since you were born. It was intended for a future officer, a lawyer, someone of status." He stared directly at me. "Not for someone choosing to abandon their future." My breath hitched. In front of my eyes, he uncapped a fountain pen, wrote out a check for the full staggering amount, and then, with deliberate cruelty, he tore it into 4 precise pieces. The ripping sound was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The 4 white squares fluttered down onto the plush rug like dead leaves. "If you choose that path," he declared, "you walk it alone." I looked desperately toward the doorway, where my mother stood. She had been watching the entire exchange. She met my pleading gaze for a heartbreaking moment, then just gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head before looking away. Her silent complicity was a second, deeper betrayal. That night, I packed a single duffel bag. I walked it alone. His contempt wasn't a one-time event. It was the legacy he gave me. The first few years in the Army were brutal. I was the colonel's daughter, a title that followed me like a curse. I worked twice as hard, studied twice as long, and volunteered for every miserable duty just to prove I wasn't there because of him, to erase his shadow. I remember one night during basic training, lying on my bunk, exhausted and lonely, soaked from a drill in the freezing rain. I was reading a tattered paperback of American essays someone had left behind, and I found it, the words of Theodore Roosevelt, the man in the arena. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." Those words became my scripture. My father was the critic. He sat clean and comfortable in the grandstands of my life, passing judgment. But I was in the arena. The mud, the sweat, the fear, the blood, they were mine. They were real. His rejection hadn't broken me. It had forged me. He wanted me to fail, to come crawling back, defeated. He never understood that in tearing up that check, he had accidentally handed me my greatest weapon. Absolute, unconditional independence. His disapproval became the armor I wore every single day. His rejection forged me into a weapon. So now, with this armor, what must I do to face him in the present? My command center wasn't in a secure, windowless room deep within Fort Bragg. It was on a wobbly, second-hand kitchen table in my cramped one-bedroom apartment, the kind of place a sergeant's salary gets you in Fayetteville. Outside, the night was thick and alive with the relentless electric chirping of cicadas, a sound that drilled into the silence. Inside, the only light came from the cold, blue-white glow of my laptop screen, painting long, distorted shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. My dinner, a can of Campbell's chicken noodle soup and a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers, sat cold and forgotten beside my elbow. I was too focused to eat, the knot of adrenaline in my stomach a more potent fuel than any food. In front of me, displayed on the screen, was a mind map. At its heart, a single name, stark and final, Leland Bishop. From that central node, branches spiderwebbed out, each one a tendril of his carefully constructed world. Shell corporations with bland corporate names, routing numbers for offshore bank accounts, a growing list of names that felt like potential co-conspirators. This wasn't going to be a messy, emotional confrontation born of anger. That was his world, not mine. This was a campaign. Just like planning a mission in hostile territory, I began with meticulous intelligence gathering. Quiet, patient, methodical. I remembered reading a book about how the FBI finally caught Bernie Madoff. It wasn't a dramatic confession or a single informant that brought him down. It was a team of forensic accountants who spent months, years following the money. They looked for the small inconsistencies, the statistical impossibilities, the anomalies that, when pieced together, revealed an undeniable criminal truth. My father saw me as a simple grunt, a blunt instrument good for following orders. He had no idea that the very skills he'd always disdained, the patience to sit still for hours, the meticulous attention to detail required to not get your team killed, the sheer, stubborn endurance forged over years of service, were now the precise weapons I was aiming squarely at the heart of his empire. While he was likely enjoying a 12-ounce steak and a glass of expensive Cabernet at some exclusive restaurant, I was here, dining on lukewarm soup and plotting his fall from grace. A week later, I found my first real thread. I was at the Coffee Scene, a popular off-base spot where soldiers came to decompress, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and cheap cologne. Over the constant hiss of the espresso machine, I overheard two non-commissioned officers from the training cadre complaining. They were griping about a newly minted lieutenant, a guy whose land navigation skills were so abysmal, as one of them put it, he could get lost in the damn PX parking lot. The other NCO snorted into his latte. Tell me about it. How'd a guy like that even make it through the Q course? I heard he graduated with honors. Honors! Can you believe it? That's when the name hit me, a small bell ringing in the back of my mind. Sterling, I knew Sterling, son of some Texas oil tycoon with a bottomless bank account. I also knew, through the ever-present base rumor mill, that his academic record before enlisting had been less than stellar. It didn't add up. You don't just magically develop the instincts and intelligence to pass the Special Forces qualification course. It's a crucible, a brutal, unforgiving process, designed specifically to weed out the weak, the lazy, and the incompetent. Sterling was, by all accounts, all three. That evening, back at my kitchen table command center, I created a new encrypted file on my laptop. I labeled it Sterling. Using the security clearance that was one of the few benefits of my job, I began to dig into his publicly available training records. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun, not yet. Just a loose thread, something to pull on. And then I saw it. It was a single data point, buried in a long, boring spreadsheet of course completion times. An anomaly. He had successfully completed a critical, notoriously difficult training module in nearly half the time of the course's fastest recorded graduate. It wasn't just impressive, it was statistically impossible. It was the first real crack in the facade. The following weeks fell into a grueling, bifurcated rhythm. By day, I was Sergeant First Class Bishop, punctual, efficient, exemplary, a ghost. I ran my squads through drills with unwavering professionalism. I was a model of discipline and quiet competence. No one could possibly suspect a thing. But when the sun went down and the bass grew quiet, I became someone else. I became an investigator. My small kitchen transformed into a data analysis cell. Night after night, fueled by bitter, instant coffee, I cross-referenced names, dates, and figures. I meticulously tracked the public transactions of the shell corporations my father controlled through a web of legal loopholes. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then undeniable. Large, lump-sum payments, always disguised as consulting fees, were being deposited shortly after certain distinguished graduates, like Sterling, received their certifications. Each number, each date, each name was a brick. And I was laying them one by one, with painstaking precision, building a wall of evidence. It was solid, it was methodical, it was irrefutable. A deep, bone-wearying exhaustion began to settle into my soul. A constant, heavy companion that sat on my shoulders. But the discipline held me upright. It was my refuge. My father had taught me to be tough, to be resilient, to never show weakness. He just never imagined that one day all that toughness would be directed back at him. My lonely path was becoming clearer with every brick I laid. I hated these events, the dog and pony shows. Once a year, the brass would haul out the latest military hardware for a combat capabilities demonstration, a carefully choreographed performance for visiting politicians and defense contractors. It was a day of pressed uniforms, forced smiles, and carefully managed optics. My first sergeant, likely knowing my aversion to the spotlight, had assigned me to logistics support, a glorified supply clerk role, tucked away behind the main staging area. I was grateful for the anonymity. My job was to stay in the shadows and make sure the people in the spotlight had everything they needed. My father, of course, was a different animal entirely. For him, this wasn't a duty, it was a stage. He thrived in this environment. Dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit that probably cost more than my last 2 paychecks combined, he moved through the crowd of dignitaries like a peacock, his perfectly coiffed silver hair catching the sunlight. He shook hands, he laughed his booming laugh that always sounded more like a command than an expression of joy, and he held court. I watched from a distance as he cornered a U.S. senator, launching into a grandiose explanation of some complex building entry technique. He gestured wildly with his hands, his voice ringing with authority, as if he himself had just breached a door under fire yesterday, instead of spending the last decade collecting exorbitant fees as a strategic consultant. For a moment, his eyes flickered in my direction. It was a fleeting glance, but it was loaded with his signature contempt, a silent reminder of my proper place in his universe. Invisible, insignificant, a servant to more important men. I simply lowered my head and went back to checking the inventory on my clipboard. Then the atmosphere shifted. It was a palpable change, a wave of gravitas that silenced the idle chatter. The crowd parted respectfully. General Marcus Thorne, the 4-star commander of the United States Army Special Operations Command, had arrived. He was a living legend, a Green Beret whose quiet professionalism was as renowned as his tactical brilliance. Men straightened their ties. Officers stood a little taller. He moved with an unhurried purpose, his presence radiating a calm, absolute authority that made my father's blustering seem theatrical and cheap. Naturally, my father was the first to react. He abruptly abandoned the senator mid-sentence and strode forward, his hand extended, that dazzling politician's smile plastered on his face. "General Thorne, what an absolute honor, sir." But General Thorne merely gave him a polite, almost dismissive nod. His gaze, sharp and analytical, swept past my father, scanning the entire area with an intensity that missed nothing. He was taking in the whole scene, not just the performance at its center. And then his eyes stopped. They stopped on me. For a moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity, the 4-star general, the man at the absolute apex of my professional world, looked directly at me, standing in the shadows with my clipboard. The world seemed to grind to a halt. All the noise, the engines, the distant thumping of helicopter blades, it all faded into a low hum. He wasn't looking at my father anymore. He wasn't looking at the senator. He was looking at me. And then he started walking. Not toward the polished displays of weaponry. Not toward the VIP grandstand. He started walking toward me. My father froze. I saw his face transition through a rapid series of emotions, from fawning self-importance to confusion, then to a flicker of raw, indignant anger as General Thorne walked right past him as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. The general's polished black shoes crunched on the gravel, each step a hammer blow to my father's ego. He stopped directly in front of me. He wasn't looking at the rank on my collar or the name tag on my chest. His eyes, which held a universe of experience, were filled with a startling, immediate understanding. They flickered down for a fraction of a second to my forearm, to the small, faded unit tattoo that was barely visible beneath my sleeve, an emblem that meant nothing to outsiders, but everything to those who had been there. He extended his hand. "Sergeant First Class Bishop," he said. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying an innate authority that had no need for volume, yet it held no trace of condescension. It was the voice of a fellow warrior. "It's an honor. I read your after-action report from—" He paused, naming a classified operation that was little more than a whisper in the halls of power. "Last year, quiet professional." He used the words, the sacred words, the highest compliment one could receive in our world. He squeezed my hand firmly, a gesture of respect, not of rank. "It's soldiers like you," he said, his eyes meeting mine, "who are the absolute backbone of this force." I couldn't speak. A lump had formed in my throat, thick and painful. All I could manage was a single sharp nod. As he turned to leave, I risked a glance at my father. His face was ashen. It was a ghastly, pale mask of pure, unadulterated shock, mingled with a rage he couldn't conceal. The game had just changed. The board had been flipped. And for the first time in my life, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, solid and firm. General Thorne's handshake wasn't just a gesture, it was a key. It unlocked a door I didn't even know existed. For 2 weeks after the demonstration, the world felt different. The whispers that used to follow me around base seemed to fade, replaced by nods of grudging respect. The weight of my father's name felt lighter on my shoulders. Then came the phone call, a crisp, professional voice from the general's own office. They wanted to formally invite me to apply for an instructor position at the Joint Special Operations University, JSOU, down in Tampa, Florida. It wasn't just a job, it was an escape route. It was a future where my value was measured by my experience, not my last name. A place where I could shape the next generation of operators, passing on the hard-won lessons from the field. It came with a salary that would be triple my current pay, a detail that brought a grim, ironic smile to my face. It meant a life of stability, of sunshine and sea breezes, hundreds of miles away from the suffocating shadow of Colonel Leland Bishop. For the first time in what felt like my entire adult life, A genuine, uncomplicated sliver of hope lodged itself in my chest. I spent days perfecting my application, polishing my service record until it gleamed. The video interview with the selection committee went perfectly. I was articulate, confident, knowledgeable. They were impressed. The master sergeant on the panel told me I was their top candidate, that I should expect a formal offer within the week. I allowed myself to dream. I looked up apartment listings in Tampa, picturing a small place with a balcony where I could drink my morning coffee and smell the salt in the air. I imagined a life where my worth was validated by a signed contract and a steady paycheck, not by a fleeting, desperate search for approval that never came. A new dawn was on the horizon. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the sun went out. The door didn't just close, it was slammed shut, the deadbolt thrown. It arrived as a brutally short, impersonal email from JSOU Human Resources. Subject: Instructor Position Application. Sergeant First Class Bishop, thank you for your interest in the position at the Joint Special Operations University. After careful consideration of changing operational needs, we have decided to go in a different direction with this hiring cycle. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. No explanation, no feedback, just a cold corporate dismissal. A digital slap in the face. My hands began to tremble. I read it again and then a third time, as if the words might change. I immediately called my contact on the selection committee, a good master sergeant I'd known for years. His voice on the other end of the line was strained, heavy with an unease that traveled through the phone. "Carrie, listen, I shouldn't be telling you this," he stammered, his tone low and cautious. "It's way above my pay grade, but there was a call, from the top, from a senior consultant with a lot of pull in DC. My blood ran cold. I knew where this was going. "This consultant," he continued, the words tasting like poison even in my ear, "expressed grave concerns about your psychological stability. Following multiple combat deployments, he said your profile made you a potential liability risk for the university. The lawyers got involved. It killed your nomination on the spot. I'm sorry, Carrie, my hands were tied." My heart didn't just sink, it stopped. It was a physical sensation, a hollow, terrifying stillness in my chest, a liability risk. He had taken my service, my sacrifices, the very things that made me qualified for the job, and twisted them into a weapon. He had painted me as broken, as unstable. There was only one person in the world with that level of influence and that depth of cruelty. Only one person who would and could do this: my father. He couldn't beat me on merit, so he had poisoned the well. He couldn't deny General Thorne's public recognition, so he had crept into the shadows and whispered lies into the ears of bureaucrats, men who feared lawsuits more than they valued honor. He had made my greatest strengths into my most damning weaknesses. The anger that rose in me wasn't the hot, searing shame I'd felt at the firing range. This was different. This was cold. This was surgical. It was a solid block of ice, forming in my chest, a chilling, absolute clarity. He had crossed a final line. This was no longer about his disdain, his disappointment. This was sabotage. This was a deliberate act of destruction. He didn't just want me to fail anymore. He wanted to annihilate me, to ensure that I could never, ever escape his orbit, his control. I sat there in the dark, staring at the screen. A quote I'd once read from the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius floated into my mind. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. He had acted with malice, with deceit, with cowardice. I would not. Have you ever felt that? The moment when a deep, personal pain suddenly transforms, when the tears dry up and are replaced by a cold, hard resolve you didn't even know you possessed? That was me, in that moment. I moved the cursor across the screen. I found the folder on my desktop named Future in Florida, filled with apartment listings and daydreams. I dragged it to the trash icon and emptied it without a second thought. Then I navigated to my secure files and opened the one I had started weeks ago. The one labeled Leland Bishop. Hope was dead. Now there was only justice. My cold anger needed a target. It needed a direction. My father had sabotaged my future, and I needed to know why. What was he protecting? The answer, I knew, lay with my first thread, Lieutenant Sterling. Why would a man like my father, a man obsessed with military prestige, go to such lengths to protect an incompetent officer? Why was he so afraid of me getting a position at JSOU, a place where, as an instructor, I might have cause to review training programs and spot weaknesses? The questions burned through me, erasing any thought of sleep. I stayed up all night, the only light in my world, the pale glow of the laptop. Fueled by stale coffee, I used my security credentials to pull up Sterling's entire service record. I wasn't just looking for financial fraud anymore. I was looking for the consequences, the human cost. I began meticulously sifting through the after-action reports, the AARs, from his unit's recent deployment to Afghanistan. It was hundreds of pages of dry, clinical military jargon, much of it redacted with thick black lines. But years in the service had taught me how to read between those lines, how to see the ghosts in the sanitized language. I scanned reports of firefights, IED strikes, and routine patrols, my eyes hunting for a single name, a single incident that didn't fit. I was no longer an investigator. I was a hunter, stalking a tragedy through a dense forest of paperwork. And then I found it. The report was designated AR-15-6, the formal code for an official investigation into a hostile engagement resulting in U.S. casualties. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. The date was August 14th. The location, the Korengal Valley, Afghanistan's Valley of Death. It was a place where bravery went to die, a treacherous maze of rocky hillsides and hidden enemy positions that had chewed up and spat out some of our best soldiers. Two names leapt off the page, so stark they seemed to have been carved into the screen with a knife. Sergeant Mark Sully Sullivan, KIA, Sergeant First Class David Diaz, KIA, killed in action. The report detailed the ambush. It cited a catastrophic tactical error on the part of the commanding officer, Lieutenant Sterling. He had ignored direct intelligence warnings and led his patrol down a narrow, exposed trail at the bottom of the valley, a route notoriously known to every soldier in the region as the death funnel. It was a rookie mistake, the kind of blunder a first-year cadet at West Point would have known to avoid. It was a death sentence. The blood in my veins turned to ice. My hands shook so violently I could barely control the mouse. With a growing sense of dread, I opened another file, the financial records I had painstakingly compiled on my father's shell corporation. I cross-referenced the dates, and there it was, the final damning piece of the puzzle. A wire transfer, 7 figures. A massive, obscene amount of money, moved from a trust fund in the Cayman Islands registered to the Sterling family, and deposited into the account of one of my father's consulting firms. The date of the transfer was exactly 3 weeks before Lieutenant Sterling had graduated with honors from the Special Forces qualification course. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. My father hadn't just sold a fraudulent qualification. He hadn't just undermined the integrity of the force he claimed to love. He had sold 2 men's lives for a payday. I barely made it to the bathroom before I doubled over the toilet, my body convulsing as I threw up the cold soup and bile. The acrid taste burning my throat was nothing compared to the profound, soul-deep revulsion that consumed me. My father. He had sold a piece of paper, a meaningless certificate, and the price had been paid in the blood of Sully and Diaz. I knew them. I'd had beers with Sully at a grimy bar just off base, listening to him talk about the fishing boat he was going to buy when he got home. I'd seen the pictures of Diaz's wife and 2 little girls that he kept tucked inside his helmet. This was no longer about me. It wasn't about a ruined career or a lifetime of feeling inadequate. It was about them. It was about their honor. It was about their stolen futures and the families they would never see again. It was about the most disgusting, unforgivable betrayal I could possibly imagine. In that moment, something inside me broke, and something new and hard settled in its place. The Bible verse echoed in my head, not as a promise of peace, but as a declaration of war. The truth will set you free. And I knew my truth now. I walked back into the living room and picked up my phone. My hand was no longer shaking. It was cold, steady, and calm. I found the number in my contacts and dialed. The voice on the other end was professional, alert. Major Reed. My own voice came out flat, devoid of all emotion. It sounded like a stranger's. "Evelyn," I said, using her first name. "It's Carrie Bishop. We need to meet, right now." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. This isn't about fraud anymore. This is murder. The diner was a greasy spoon off the all-American freeway. The kind of anonymous, 24-hour place that smelled of stale coffee and fried bacon. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked, and the fluorescent lights hummed a weary tune. It was the perfect place for a conversation that could never happen on base. It was the antithesis of the polished mahogany-paneled officers' clubs where my father conducted his business. This was the underworld, and I was stepping into it. Major Evelyn Reed from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, didn't look like a high-ranking investigator. Dressed in civilian clothes, a pair of simple jeans and a nondescript blouse, she could have passed for a tired high school teacher grading papers. But her eyes were a different story. They were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. They assessed me over the chipped Formica tabletop as I slid into the booth opposite her. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. The time for that was long past. I pulled a small, encrypted, external hard drive from my pocket and slid it across the table. It stopped next to a puddle of condensation from her glass of iced tea. "On here," I said, my voice low and even, "you'll find preliminary financial transactions, the training records of at least 3 suspicious graduates, including Lieutenant Sterling, and the full unredacted after-action report concerning the deaths of Sergeant Sullivan and Sergeant First Class Diaz." Evelyn didn't say a word. She simply took out a government-issue laptop, plugged in the drive, and began to type. The only sound for the next 5 minutes was the soft, rhythmic clicking of the keyboard and the distant clatter of plates from the kitchen. I watched her face. I saw the initial professional skepticism melt away, replaced by a focused intensity, which then gave way to a look of utter, undisguised horror. She finally looked up, her face pale under the harsh lighting. "My God, Bishop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You were right. This isn't just fraud. The pattern of payments, the falsified records, the direct link to the casualties. This is a criminal enterprise. This is a RICO case. RICO, the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the legal hammer used to bring down mob bosses and criminal syndicates. She was putting my father in the same category. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. To convict him, to make it stick, we need more than the paper trail. Financials can be explained away by clever lawyers. We need to prove intent. We need a direct link, something that ties him personally to the criminal act, not just to the money. Her sharp eyes locked onto mine. We need his own words. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air between us. "Sergeant First Class Bishop," she said, her tone shifting from investigator to commander. "You're the only one who can get close to him without raising suspicion. You're the only one he might talk to. Are you willing?" I knew exactly what she was asking. A wire, a recording. I would have to willingly walk into the lion's den, face the man who created me, and then tried to destroy me, and coax a confession from his lips. A wave of nausea, cold and acidic, rolled through my stomach. It was a vile, disgusting thought. But then I saw their faces. Sully laughing over a beer. Diaz proudly showing me a picture of his little girl on her first day of school. The revulsion was instantly extinguished by a cold, hard resolve. There was a simple principle I learned in the field. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. I would do this carefully. I would do this right. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What do you need?" A few days later, Evelyn met me in a deserted parking lot. She handed me a pen. It was a sleek black fountain pen, expensive looking, the kind my father favored. "It's a digital recorder," she explained. 8-hour capacity, crystal clear audio. The activation is on the top. 1 click to start, 1 to stop. Simple. I took the pen from her. It felt heavier than any weapon I had ever carried. My M4 was designed to take a life to protect others. This pen was designed to kill a man's life, his reputation, his freedom, his entire world. With a single treacherous click. This was my weapon now. Not to kill a person, but to kill a lie. "We have enough probable cause to start surveillance," Evelyn added, her voice all business now. "Every call he makes, every transaction he initiates is now on our radar. We're building the case brick by brick. But this pen, Carrie," she looked at me, her expression grim. "This is the tip of the spear. It has to hit the heart." The plan was set. It was as elegant as it was ugly. In 2 weeks, my father was scheduled to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for Integrity and Honor at the annual Patriots Gala at the Maine Officers Club. It was the perfect stage, a stage for his monumental arrogance, for his hypocrisy to be on full display. And it would be the stage for his downfall. The grand ballroom of the Fort Bragg Officers Club was a sea of hypocrisy. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and catered prime rib, glittered under the light of crystal chandeliers. Men in starched dress uniforms and women in shimmering evening gowns mingled, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I stood in the shadows at the back of the room, a ghost in my perfectly pressed Army service uniform. I was a discordant note in their symphony of self-congratulation, and I felt every eye that skimmed past me. On stage, bathed in a brilliant white spotlight, my father was basking in the glow. He held the award, a heavy crystal eagle perched on a marble base, and beamed at the adoring crowd. The award was for a lifetime of dedication to integrity and honor. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. "Integrity," he began, his voice filled with a practiced false emotion that made my skin crawl. is the bedrock of a soldier. It is the moral compass that guides us in the darkest of nights. The audience, a collection of some of the most powerful people on the East Coast, hung on his every word. Honor, he continued, placing a hand over his heart, is not a commodity to be bought or sold. I almost laughed out loud. In the pocket of my uniform jacket, my fingers found the cool, smooth surface of the pen. With a soft, nearly inaudible click, I activated it for the last time, just to be sure. The recording from a few hours prior was secure. I had gone to his office under the guise of offering a daughter's congratulations, of wanting to finally make peace. The bait was simple, an appeal to his ego, and he had taken it, hook, line, and sinker. The sterling situation, his recorded voice, smug and condescending, echoed in my memory. The kid's an idiot, but his father pays his bills on time. It's how the world works, Carrie Ann. You should learn that. Now here he was, preaching about honor. The room erupted in thunderous applause. My cue. As the clapping began to subside, I started to walk. It wasn't a march. It was a slow, deliberate, and perfectly paced advance. Not too fast, not too slow. Each step was measured, the rhythmic tap of my low-quarter dress shoes on the polished floor like the ticking of a time bomb. The room began to fall silent as heads turned. Conversations faltered. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd as I moved from the shadows into the light. On stage, my father paused mid-sentence, his smile tightening. He squinted into the crowd, annoyance flashing across his face before he quickly masked it. "Ah," he said, forcing a chuckle, trying to reclaim control of the room. "My daughter, Sergeant First Class Carrie Bishop. It seems she's come to share in this wonderful moment." I ignored him. I ignored the hundreds of stares, the whispers that started to bubble up. I reached the front of the stage but didn't stop. I ascended the 3 short steps, my eyes locked on a single point. I wasn't looking at him. I was looking directly at General Marcus Thorne, who sat in the seat of honor at the head table on the stage. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But my legs were steady, my hands were still. I was a weapon on a set trajectory. I stopped directly in front of the 4-star general's seat. A new silence fell over the ballroom, this one absolute. It was so quiet, I imagined I could hear the fizz of champagne bubbles in the glasses on the tables. I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my pocket and placed 2 items on the white linen tablecloth in front of the lectern: the black fountain pen and my personal cell phone. The moment was a signal. At the back of the ballroom, the main doors were quietly blocked by 2 stone-faced men in dark suits. On my right, I saw Major Evelyn Reed rise from her seat at a nearby table. She wasn't a tired teacher anymore. She was a hunter, and her eyes were locked on her prey. Simultaneously, the massive presentation screen behind the stage, which had been displaying a flattering, heroic portrait of my father, flickered. His image was replaced by the simple, stark user interface of an audio playback application. I chanced a look at General Thorne. His face was a complex mask of grim understanding and profound disappointment. He looked at me, then at the pen, and then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the authorization I needed. With my phone, I hit play. The connection was wireless. The sound was instantaneous, piped through the ballroom's state-of-the-art speaker system. And the voice that boomed through the hall was not the polished, inspirational speaker from a moment ago. It was my father's true voice, raspy, arrogant, contemptuous. The sterling situation, the kid's an idiot, but his father pays his bills on time. It's how the world works, Carrie Ann. You should learn that. Honor is for the little people, for the grunts who die in the dirt. For men like us, it's about results. A collective gasp swept through the room. The color drained from Leland Bishop's face. His self-assured posture collapsed as if his strings had been cut. He stared at the screen, then at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. No sound coming out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. The audio file continued to play, revealing every sordid detail of his criminal enterprise, every dismissal of the men whose lives were forfeit for his greed. The shocked silence in the room began to break, replaced by a rising tide of horrified, angry whispers. Alliances built over decades of backslapping and bourbon were dissolving in real time. Major Evelyn Reed was now on the stage. She walked past me, her steps firm and confident, and stopped beside my father. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Colonel Leland Bishop," she said, her voice clear and cold in the sudden silence. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and your role in the deaths of Sergeant Mark Sullivan and Sergeant First Class David Diaz." Justice didn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It came with the soft, silent click of a pen. The aftermath was chaos. A controlled, military-grade chaos, but chaos nonetheless. As my father, his face a vacant, lifeless mask, was led away in handcuffs by the CID agents, the glittering crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. The friends, the business partners, the sycophants who had been clapping for him just minutes earlier, now actively avoided his gaze, turning their backs, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. I saw the wives of prominent officers subtly tugging their husbands away, creating distance, quarantining themselves from the stench of his disgrace. An empire built on lies had crumbled to dust in the space of a single audio recording. General Thorne remained on the stage, his face carved from granite, issuing quiet orders to the military police, who were now securing the ballroom. But I barely heard him. I just stood there, a statue in my dress uniform, watching the man who was my father being escorted out of his own life. The high-octane adrenaline that had fueled my every action for the past hour drained away, leaving a hollow, cavernous emptiness in its wake. I had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, a surge of righteous satisfaction, but I felt none of it. There was no joy, no thrill of victory. There was only a profound, aching void. That man, as monstrous as he had become, was still the one who had taught me how to tie my shoes on the front porch of our old house. The truth had been set free, as the saying goes. But I was learning that freeing the truth can leave a wound of its own. After the ballroom was cleared and the last of the gawking staff had been dismissed, General Thorne found me in a small, empty conference room backstage. He didn't say much. He just walked over and placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. "You did a very difficult thing tonight, Sergeant First Class," he said, his deep voice resonating in the quiet room. "But it was the right thing. You defended the honor of this force more than any award ever could." His words were a balm, a validation I had craved for years, but they couldn't fill the void inside me. They were a bandage on a wound that was far too deep. Major Evelyn Reed joined us a moment later, her demeanor all professional efficiency. "We have everything we need, Bishop," she stated, her tone crisp. "He confessed to everything on that recording. This case is going in the textbooks. You did good." Everyone kept telling me I did good. They saw a successful operation, a criminal brought to justice, a corrupt network dismantled. I felt like the sole survivor of a bloody battle, left standing alone on a battlefield littered with the corpses of my own past. The drive home to my apartment was a blur. The streets of Fayetteville, usually so familiar, felt alien. There would be no champagne tonight, no victory celebration. I walked into my small apartment and went straight to the kitchen. I sat down at the wobbly table, the same table that had served as my command center for this entire campaign. Now it was just an empty table. The laptop was closed, the files were gone. The war was over. I had won. I had exposed the truth. I had secured justice for Sully and for Diaz, and for God knows how many others. I had defended my own honor against my father's lies, but in doing so, I had also personally detonated my own family, what little was left of it. The victory felt strangely like defeat, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I let myself cry. The tears weren't for the man who was being processed at the county jail. They weren't for the monster he had become. They were for the little girl who once trailed after him, desperate for a single nod of approval, a single "well done, Carrie Ann." I cried for the loss of that little girl's innocence. I cried for the ugly, bitter price of truth. I sat there in the dark for a long time, the silent tears tracing paths down my cheeks, and when they finally stopped and the deep, shuddering breaths subsided, a quiet certainty settled over me. That chapter of my life, the one defined by him, by his shadow, by my desperate need for his validation, was well and truly over. 1 year later, the legal storm surrounding Leland Bishop had finally passed. He was convicted on a slew of federal charges: fraud, conspiracy, and 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The sentence was decades in a place where his name and influence meant nothing. I never visited him in prison. I never wrote. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way forever. My own life had found a new, quieter rhythm. I was still in the Army, but things were different. The respect I received from my peers and my superiors was my own, earned in sweat and service, untainted by anyone's shadow. I had officially accepted the instructor position at the Joint Special Operations University. My transfer papers were signed, and I was moving to Tampa next month. The Florida apartment I had once dreamed of was now a reality. But this afternoon, I was in a different kind of place. A playground on Fort Bragg, filled with the bright, chaotic sounds of children's laughter. It was a weekly event for Gold Star families, a support program for the spouses and children of soldiers who had been killed in action. I was helping a quiet 8-year-old boy with serious brown eyes, the son of a fallen infantryman, master a particularly tricky knot. His name was Leo. He was struggling with a bowline, his small fingers fumbling with the rope. I knelt beside him on the soft wood chips, guiding his hands through the motion. "You make the rabbit hole," I said softly. "The rabbit comes up the hole, goes around the big tree, and then back down the hole." Suddenly, the loop held. His face lit up with a brilliant, triumphant smile. "Whoa, how are you so good at that, Miss Carrie?" Leo asked, his eyes wide with admiration as he stared at the perfect knot. I felt a genuine smile spread across my own face, easy and unforced. "A soldier taught me," I told him, my voice warm. "A long time ago, he said a good knot can save your life one day." I wasn't lying. The soldier who had taught me that very knot, on a rare father-daughter camping trip, when I was just a little older than Leo, was my own father. It was one of the few untarnished good memories I had of him, a flicker of light in a long, dark history. For a long time, I had tried to bury memories like that, because they were too painful, too connected to the man he became. But I was learning now. I was learning to sift through the wreckage of the past and keep the small, useful things of value while letting the rest of it burn. His legacy was a pile of ash and deceit. Mine would be different. It would be found here in the triumphant smile of a little boy who just learned something new. It would be in the quiet support I could offer to these families who had sacrificed so much. It would be in the lessons of integrity, of honor, of truth that I would pass on to the next generation of soldiers at JSOU. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I took a drive. I went east, out of Fayetteville, toward the coast. I ended up at Wilmington, sitting on the cool sand, watching the endless rhythmic procession of the waves. They crashed on the shore, a constant, powerful cycle of destruction and renewal, washing the world clean again and again. A steady breeze blew in off the Atlantic, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt, and it felt like it was blowing away the last lingering ghosts of the past. Staring out at the vast expanse of the ocean, I realized I was no longer Colonel Bishop's daughter. I wasn't the hero who took down her own father. Those were labels, roles I had been forced to play in someone else's drama. They weren't me. I was just Carrie, a soldier, a teacher, a survivor. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. A new dawn was waiting for me in Florida. I didn't know exactly what it would bring, but for the first time in my life, I felt a deep, unshakable certainty. The path ahead was mine to chart. The orders were my own. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. My journey to this beach, to this moment of peace, was long and lonely. But as I share this, I know I'm not truly alone. I know so many of you have walked your own difficult paths, fighting silent battles to reclaim your own soul. This space, this channel, is where stories like ours find a voice and prove that strength is real. If my journey resonated with you, please subscribe to be part of this community. Share this story with someone who needs to hear they are not alone. And in the comments below, tell me, what was the first step you took toward your own self-made dawn? I'll be reading.